Every single thing you've eaten today requires one ingredient you've probably never heard of. Not water, not sunlight, something else. An element so essential that without it, every plant on Earth would die, every animal would starve, and every human being, all 8 billion of us, would be gone within a generation. This element has no substitute. You can't synthesize it, you can't manufacture it. The only way to get it is to dig it out of the ground. And 70% of the world's supply sits beneath one country. The American food system, the farms that feed this country and much of the world, run on a resource we don't control. While we still mine some here, our own reserves are hitting a terminal decline. We maintain no strategic stockpile, and we're becoming more dependent on foreign imports every single year. We worry about oil, we worry about rare earth minerals, but the resource that actually controls whether America eats, almost nobody is paying attention. This is the story of phosphorus, the invisible ingredient in everything you've ever eaten, and how one country you seldom think about quietly gained control over America's entire food supply. Now, let's start with what phosphorus is and why it matters so much. You probably remember the periodic table from school. Phosphorus is element 15. It's in every cell of every living thing on the planet. Your DNA, it's held together by phosphorus. The energy your muscles use to move, that requires phosphorus. Every thought you've ever had needed phosphorus to happen. And plants need it just as badly. Phosphorus is what scientists call a limiting nutrient, meaning if a plant doesn't have enough of it, nothing else matters. You can give a plant perfect soil, perfect sunlight, all the water it needs, but without phosphorus, it won't grow. Here's what makes phosphorus different from almost every other element we depend on. Think about nitrogen, another crucial nutrient for plants. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the air you're breathing right now. In 1909, a German chemist named Fritz Haber figured out how to pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and turn it into fertilizer. And that invention now feeds 3 to 4 billion people. Essentially unlimited supply pulled from thin air. Now, phosphorus doesn't work like that. There's no phosphorus floating in the atmosphere, you can't synthesize it in a lab, you can't manufacture it in a factory. The only way to get it is to find it in the ground. The US government puts it simply: there are no substitutes for phosphorus in agriculture. According to the World Bank, fertilizers are responsible for about 50% of global food production, half of all food on Earth. And phosphorus is one of the 3 essential ingredients in that fertilizer. So we have an element that half of global food production depends on, that we can only get from mining, and that has no substitute whatsoever. The obvious question becomes, well, who controls it? We'll get there, but first let me show you how valuable this resource has always been. For most of human history, farmers didn't understand why their soil got tired, why their crops grew smaller year after year. They just knew that certain things helped: animal manure, bone meal, rotting fish. Then in the 1800s, scientists figured out what was actually happening. Plants needed phosphorus. And they discovered that certain islands in the Pacific Ocean had something remarkable. Mountains of bird droppings piled up over thousands of years, sometimes 200 feet deep. They called it guano, and it was incredibly rich in phosphorus. And what happens next sounds almost ridiculous. The greatest powers on Earth went to war over bird poop. Peru controlled the richest guano islands, and between 1840 and 1870, they exported 12 million tons of the stuff. At peak prices, guano sold for the equivalent of $76 a pound. British trading companies made fortunes. The famous saying at the time was, "The House of Gibbs made their dibs selling turds of foreign birds." In 1856, President Franklin Pierce signed something called the Guano Islands Act, which let Americans claim any uninhabited island with guano on it. This was America's first real experiment with overseas expansion, and we claimed nearly 100 islands, including Midway, all because of bird droppings. But the real insanity was the War of the Pacific. In 1879, Chile invaded Bolivia and Peru over guano and nitrate deposits. Over 25,000 people were killed or wounded fighting over fertilizer, and Chile's treasury grew 900% from the conquest. The Inca, it turns out, had always understood the value of this resource, even centuries earlier. Under Inca law, disturbing the guano-producing birds was punishable by death. By 1880, all the known guano deposits were gone, mined out completely. The seabird populations that created them collapsed from 53 million birds to just over 4 million. Thousands dead in war over fertilizer, nations scrambling to claim tiny islands covered in bird droppings. That's how valuable phosphorus has always been. And that's when it was scattered across dozens of countries. Today, it's concentrated in one. So by the 20th century, the world had found bigger phosphate deposits, underground rock formations laid down by ancient seas millions of years ago. The US had massive reserves in Florida, Russia had some, China had some. But one country had more than everyone else combined: Morocco. 50 billion metric tons of phosphate rock, 70% of all the known reserves on Earth, sitting beneath the North African desert. The company that controls Morocco's phosphate is called OCP, Office Chevron des Phosphates. Apologies to all the French speakers out there, I know I butchered that. Founded in 1920, state-owned ever since. Today it operates the world's largest fertilizer complex, employs over 20,000 workers, and generates billions of dollars a year in revenues. Morocco's reserves at current consumption rates could last several centuries. It's become the country that will control whether the world eats. Now, there's a part of this story that's harder to talk about, but is important to understand. A significant portion of Morocco's phosphate comes from a place called Western Sahara, a territory that Morocco has occupied since 1975. That year, as Spain prepared to leave its former colony, Morocco organized what it called the Green March. 350,000 Moroccan civilians walked into Western Sahara, with 25,000 soldiers hidden among them. The indigenous people were never consulted. Many fled to refugee camps in Algeria, where somewhere between 90,000 and 170,000 people still live today, nearly 50 years later. The International Court of Justice has ruled that there's no legal basis for Moroccan sovereignty. The United Nations still considers Western Sahara a non-self-governing territory. In late 2024, the European Court of Justice ruled that Morocco has no sovereignty, stating that trade agreements cannot include products from the territory without the consent of the indigenous people. But the truth of it is, Morocco controls the land. And beneath that land sits the Boukra mine, connected to the coast by a 100-kilometer conveyor belt, the longest in the world visible from space. Some of the phosphate in your food may have traveled down that belt. Several countries and investment funds have divested from Western Sahara phosphates over ethical concerns. Norway's government pension fund, the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, has excluded multiple companies for their involvement there. But the phosphate keeps flowing because the world needs it and because there's increasingly nowhere else to get it. And here's what makes this personal for Americans. We used to dominate this industry. The United States was the world's largest phosphate producer starting around 1900. For over a century, American phosphate, mostly from Florida's Bone Valley region, fed American farms and got exported around the world. In 1980, US production peaked at 54.4 million metric tons. We produced 40% of the world's supply, but then it collapsed. Today, the US produces 23 million tons, a 63% drop from our peak. In 2006, China passed us. We went from a world leader to an also-ran within a single generation. And American reserves are running out. Florida's deposits, which once seemed endless, are being exhausted. At current consumption rates, US phosphate reserves could become economically unviable in just 20 to 40 years. And meanwhile, our import dependency has spiked. Because of trade disputes and tariffs on Moroccan fertilizer, we currently get almost all our imports from Peru. But Peru's supplies are a drop in the bucket compared to what we'll eventually need. In November 2025, the US government finally added phosphorus to the official list of critical minerals. 68 bipartisan lawmakers signed a letter urging that decision. The Fertilizer Institute put it simply, food security is national security. But recognition is not the same as action, and so far, there's been no action. So what does it mean that Morocco controls 70% of the world's phosphorus? What could they actually do with that leverage? Well, let's look at what other countries have already done. In 2008, China slapped a 135% export tariff on their phosphate to keep it for domestic use. Phosphate fertilizer prices spiked 800% in 16 months. Farmers around the world couldn't afford to fertilize their fields. Food prices soared. The crisis contributed to political instability across the developing world. China did that, and they only control about 5% of global reserves. In 2021, China stopped phosphate exports entirely. Turkey restricted exports. Russia suspended exports after invading Ukraine. Phosphate prices quadrupled within 2 years. Current restrictions impact 20% of global fertilizer trade and threaten more than half of fertilizer supply for 24 countries. Now imagine if Morocco did the same thing. They wouldn't even need to cut off exports completely. They could simply raise prices. They could offer preferential deals to allies and let everyone else pay more. They could decide that African nations, where Morocco is aggressively building diplomatic relationships through phosphate diplomacy, get first access, while the United States waits in line. This isn't completely hypothetical leverage, it's already being used. Morocco's phosphate company CEO travels with King Mohammed VI on diplomatic tours across Africa. OCP has reached over 4 million farmers in 42 African countries. They've built a 54% market share across the continent. Phosphate isn't just a commodity for Morocco, it's a foreign policy tool. And the math is brutal for countries that depend on imports. India imports 90% of its phosphate, and when supplies ran short, protests erupted during planting season. Sub-Saharan Africa imports 90% of its fertilizer, and 205 million people there already face food insecurity. A significant supply disruption could crash food production across the developing world. And the United States isn't immune to this leverage. Yes, we still produce our own phosphate, for now. But our high-grade reserves are disappearing, and when they run out, where do we go? Not China, they're already restricting exports to save what little they have left. Not Russia, geopolitically unreliable, to put it mildly. So that leaves Morocco. When American phosphate runs out, Morocco will be the only option at scale. Now here's maybe the most frustrating part. We actually already have technologies that could reduce our dependency. You can recover phosphorus from wastewater. A company called Ostara has developed systems that pull phosphorus out of sewage and turn it into fertilizer. Their largest plant in Chicago serves 4.5 million people and produces 9,000 tons of fertilizer per year. Scientists estimate if we treated all global wastewater this way, we could recover a significant portion of current phosphorus production. However, even if we recycled every single drop of human waste, it would only cover about 20 to 30% of what global agriculture requires. It's a meaningful buffer, but not a replacement for mining. But here's the reality. Despite all these technologies, less than 1% of phosphorus is currently recycled globally. Virgin phosphate rock from Morocco is still cheaper than recycled phosphorus. The economic incentives are pointing in the wrong direction. And from mining to consumption, an estimated 95% of phosphorus is lost along the way, washed into waterways, locked into landfills, flushed down drains. We have solutions, but we're not ready to use them. Here's what I keep coming back to. We built a global food system that feeds 8 billion people, a tremendous accomplishment. But half of that food depends on phosphorus, and 70% of that phosphorus is controlled by Morocco. There's no substitute, and we don't have a synthetic alternative, and the new technologies aren't growing fast enough. The US is watching its own reserves disappear while becoming increasingly dependent on imports, and despite congressional action, we're not building that strategic stockpile. And most Americans are not even talking about phosphorus. We fought wars over guano when phosphorus was spread across dozens of tiny islands. Now it's concentrated under one country and we're doing nothing to prepare. One researcher puts it bluntly. A world dependent on phosphorus is much more vulnerable than a world dependent on oil because oil can be substituted using alternative resources. We spent the last 50 years worried about Middle Eastern oil. Maybe instead we should have been paying attention to North African phosphorus. Because one day soon, Morocco will control whether America eats, and almost nobody is talking about it.